Today, we return to Abraham's encounter with God. As mentioned in an earlier sermon, Abraham assumed the unenviable role of God's chosen human consort, which included the task of challenging God's assumptions and trying to change God's mind when God seemed to be wandering down a path contrary to God's nature and promise. This was part of the job description of God's anointed in the Hebrew scriptures that Abraham and Moses after him most notably followed. However, there is one individual not numbered among God's Old Testament anointed ones, who nonetheless took on the mantle of consort, and that is Satan, who in the book of Job had not yet fallen from God's grace, and who convinced God to lift the hedge of protection around Job so that he, in God's behalf, might test him to prove whether his faith was as strong as God assumed. In every instance, these consorts insist that God be faithful and just. This insistence was conveyed in Abraham's efforts to remind God of the divine promise that compelled him to uproot his family and venture into the unknown, assured that God would grant him and Sarah, his wife, an heir. And their descendants would be as plentiful as the stars of heaven. You can hear the urgency, the desperation in Abraham's voice for God to do something, since he and Sarah, both advanced in years, were not feeling any younger. Their spirits were willing, but their bodies were weak. However, God was equally insistent that a promise made would be a promise fulfilled, and that they must live in the certainty of that promise. In other words, if God is going to do something remarkable and life-changing for us, we must also do something in return by being faithful, faithfully active as God's children, living in the conviction that God's promise will be fulfilled. Now, we often understand divine intervention as an unexpected, unnatural, and miraculous event that shakes the foundation of our sense of reality, causing us to see life as never before, because now our sense of reality is encompassed by a spiritual dimension. Faith is an awareness that divine intervention is not an unnatural force that interrupts our reality, but becomes reality itself, a reality that shatters our sense and illusions of truth. Jesus said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free." But nowadays, amid a tidal wave of conspiracy theories, it is difficult to know what truth is. It is here I like to distinguish truth from fact. Facts are reliable, empirical, tangible data that prove something is what we understand it to be. Truth, though often equated with fact, in my estimation, is more subjective, a principle of behavior and social outlook based upon both empirical, tangible data yet also subjected to an intuitive sixth sense, enabling us to respond to the data differently. Several members of a church that I served in Wilton, Connecticut, were residents of Newtown, Connecticut, where the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting occurred. Yet amid the indisputable evidence of this tragedy, conspiracy theorist Alex Jones contended that the shooting was a staged hoax. This is the same person, by the way, that accused Michelle Obama of being a man posing as a woman. These outrageous allegations incited harassing phone calls and threats toward parents of those deceased children until legal action was finally taken against Jones that may destroy his financial capacity to inflict more lies. Divine intervention is not an unnatural force that interrupts our reality, but reality itself that shatters our illusions of truth and insists that we, as children of God, be actively involved in the effort to make God's truth an indisputable reality. The August 2nd referendum on abortion in Kansas might be interpreted as another act of divine intervention. And I say so with the utmost caution because, as mentioned in an earlier sermon, I strongly believe, with many people who oppose abortion, that life begins at conception. But what I differ from those who oppose abortion is that if America strongly valued the right to life, it would provide the required conditions, including universal health care and universal prenatal care, a living wage, affordable housing, along with all the other necessary supports that would sustain the lives of women and minimize their need for an abortion, which should nonetheless be made available and safe for them also. In this state, where the conservative majority proudly flexed its muscle, convinced that voters would vote to ban abortions, the voters overwhelmingly shattered their illusions in favor of women's rights to choose. Now, rights are inalienable, indisputable truths based largely upon moral, spiritual principles of how we should relate to one another. So whenever Jesus tells a parable involving master-slave relations, I approach it with caution, realizing these stories were often used by slavers in the 1800s to elicit unsavory devotion from those they enslaved. But this particular parable was one that would have required intense editing on the part of these slavers because it involved a way of relationship between master and slave that could never have been tolerated. Blessed are those slaves whom the master finds alert when he comes, said Jesus. For truly I tell you, he will fasten his belt and have them sit down and eat, and he will come and serve them. God is inviting and calling you into a divine compact in which you are no longer passive slaves waiting for the master's presence and instructions to act. We know the goodness that God desires. It cries out from the mouths of every person victimized by violence, victimized by the callousness of corporate greed, victimized by the hardened hearts of political leaders who have betrayed the trust of their people. It is the desperate cry to do something now. Divine intervention will amount to little until we, God's offsprings, take to heart the conviction that we are also agents of answered prayer. God's divine intervention, who through our voices, through our active involvement, through our vote, can turn the tables, move mountains, and make miracles happen. The motto of our denomination, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, is God's work, our hands. People of God, get to work. Do something. Amen.